Hello, everyone. I'm Carrie Kennedy, president of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights and a member of the National Advisory Council for the Center of Victims of Torture. I am so pleased that all of you have joined us for this virtual celebration of the United Nations International Day in Support of Victims of Torture, the presentation of our annual Eclipse Award, and as we say farewell to our leader, Curt Goering. I was a sophomore in college working as an intern in a tiny back room at Amnesty International in Washington, D.C., when Curt Goering handed me a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That moment changed my life. Curt's kindness and generosity to me, his commitment to justice, and his knowledge of how to actually get things done greatly influenced my decision to spend the rest of my life working on human rights. Curt, I thank you with all my heart. And I thank CVT for doing the hardest work in the field of human rights, the work of healing. Too many of my friends and colleagues have ended up in treatment here, and without exception, they all say CVT was the first time they felt safe. Those who have endured torture have experienced some of the most horrible things people can do to one another. We mourn the victims of torture, the Rohingya, the Syrians and Iraqis, for Black Americans, including George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Daunte Wright, and the countless others who have senselessly lost their lives at the hands of those who are sworn to protect them. The guilty verdict of Derek Chauvin gives us hope that a new day is dawning, one in which domestic perpetrators of violence and torture are held accountable for their actions. But we know this is just the beginning in a long road towards justice. Today, we honor those who have lost their lives to torture and those who have survived, but are left with the mental and physical scars reminding them every day of the horrible injustice they endured. We acknowledge their pain and the pain of their family members because we know that torture does not affect just the person it touches, but their whole community for generations to come. We celebrate those who have found courage and strength, light and hope within themselves, refusing to let the trauma of their past rob them of their future. So today we lift up all survivors. We hear their stories. We promise to stand alongside them and support them. And we commit to creating a world free of torture and holding those who commit torture around the world and in our own backyards accountable for their actions. In doing so, we honor an individual who has himself been a champion for accountability. Keith Ellison, Attorney General for the state of Minnesota, is this year's recipient of CVT's annual Eclipse Award. But before we present our award, I want to take a moment to express my heartfelt gratitude to Curt for his service at CVT. With grace and grit, Curt's steady hand of leadership has guided CVT in becoming one of the leading torture treatment centers in the world. Under his tutelage, CVT has greatly expanded to serve even more survivors from all corners of the globe and has tirelessly advocated on their behalf, all in fulfillment of CVT's mission to one day realize a world without torture. He will be greatly missed, and I invite you to join me in thanking him for his service and wish him well in his next stage of life. Let's hear now from Curt as he reflects on his past 9 years with CVT and shares his hopes for the future.
There's so much good momentum at CVT. There's so many exciting things that are underway. The organization is pretty healthy financially, programmatically, and otherwise. There's a lot of great innovation, incredible expertise and commitment at the staff level. So after nearly 10 years, I made the decision that now is probably a good time for me to move on. So as of the 1st of July, I'll be stepping down as executive director. The decision for me was not an easy one. there's a lot that will continue that part of me wants to stay a part of. When I first came, I remember people outside Minnesota who knew CVT referring to CVT as Minnesota's best kept secret. And yet it does such incredible work. It transforms the lives of thousands and thousands of people. And so one of the things that we have tried to do is sort of expand that secret into something that is more well known. Our mission has remained the same. We still have our founding vision to heal the wounds of torture of survivors, family members, and community, and to stop torture worldwide. That part hasn't changed. What we've been able to do within that mission has changed quite a bit. So how we've applied that, what we understand as our mission. One of the most important things, I think, is the number of survivors that CVT has been able to serve annually now, which runs close to 30,000. One individual who comes to mind is a woman I'll call Mary, who I met in northern Uganda in a place called Lukoti, outside Gulu, where we have our offices. Lukoti was the site of a massacre during the conflict between the Lord's Resistance Army and the government of Uganda. And this woman's family was all murdered. She herself was abducted by the LRA. She was forced to become a porter as well as a sex slave to LRA commanders. She became pregnant. She bore a child. And after the war settled down, she came back to Lukoti, to the community where she was from, and was not well accepted back into the community because she came with her, with her child, and that child was a symbol to the community of what that community had gone through. It's just one of those stories that it leaves a lasting impression of the tragedy and the pain that people carry with them, and that doesn't go away. They learn to cope with it as she was doing, but it's not something that is you flip a switch and it's gone. One of the ways CVT has been able to exercise, I think, influence disproportionate to its size is because we are one of the few organizations that brings the voices of survivors to the policy debates. We're able to explain from our work with survivors how certain policies affect, torture survivors. But there's so much more that we can and should be doing. The need is definitely there. The number of refugees and asylum seekers and internally displaced now is close to 80 million individuals, higher than at any time since the Second World War. Many of those individuals are torture survivors, and many of those torture survivors are in need of specialized care. So the thousands that we reach for each one of those annually, that's critically important, and yet there are millions that are in need of the kind of services that CVT provides. And so there's a ton of work to do, and I think CVT has enormous potential, great assets to build on in order to have a greater impact in the world. There are no geographical limitations on what our mission applies to. And unfortunately, torture is still used on a massive and wide-scale basis, systematic basis, in dozens, scores of countries around the world. That applies also to the United States, where there's increasing evidence now that the U.S. has been involved in serious torture, and that as more information becomes available about police tactics and methods, which result in torture, including torture to death, as well as within the abuses within the criminal justice system, that these are situations that CVT's mandate also needs to address. We can't separate out because they happen domestically. Somehow our mission doesn't apply. I really am optimistic about CVT's future, CVT's potential is huge. There's so much space for CBT to become a truly global organization. We've made some important steps in that direction, but there's a lot more that we can do.
Is there any way now that the future for CBT will be taking the mission a little further?
I think the mission will be applied to new kinds of situations in the future. And in fact, now we're beginning to look at what CBT's role might be when there is torture committed by law enforcement officers, for example, or within the criminal justice system. When there are abuses that rise to the level of torture, what should CBT's role there be? So I think our mission applies to abuses, domestic abuses here at home, just as it applies to countries overseas. And in fact, it's really important for CBT to uphold the principle that torture is torture, whether it's committed by the U.S. government or whether it's committed by another government somewhere. And I think what there is a sense of is that there is a role, and that CBT cannot be silent in the face of these abuses, some of which rise to the level of torture. There are many community-based organizations with long experience and a lot of knowledge, and our role may be to support their efforts, to amplify their voices.
I agree with you. I think that this issue is too big and too deep for one organization. And I think if all the organizations pool their resources and their strengths together, that we will make some headway. Tell us, why now are we, working on domestic human rights violence? What really was the impetus to do it now?
Well, there's been a conversation within CBT during the entire time I've been here about what CBT's role might be with respect to domestic violations. After the murder of George Floyd, which was so obviously a clear case of an individual being tortured to death in full public view, CBT could no longer wait. We needed to be part of that community response, that national response, that global response, really. And so we're taking steps, much too late, but I think the fact that we're doing it now is critically important. There's a consensus now, there's a determination, and I think CBT can make a very important contribution to this really difficult human rights issue in the U.S. It's also very important to many survivors that those perpetrators who committed these horrendous acts against individuals, acts of torture, acts of crimes against humanity, sometimes it rises to that level, that for survivors and for society as a whole, that these crimes not go unpunished. There's a role for CBT to support survivors in their being able to document, what happened, in order for perpetrators to be held accountable.
I can see that, because when a survivor gets to start telling their story, that is the beginning of their rehabilitation. And if there are many survivors telling similar stories, then you have to hold accountable maybe governments, departments, whoever. So it does make a big difference in the work of rehabilitation of survivors of torture.
It absolutely does. And at the end of the day, it says to survivors that what the torturers told them is a lie, that no one is going to believe you, that this didn't really happen, we're going to deny it. One of the things that has been so inspirational to me, and really a constant source of inspiration, has been to see the resilience of survivors, and to be able to learn to know some of the survivors. their courage and the strength in overcoming what they've been through has just been a constant source of inspiration. But also, in addition, the larger CBT community of volunteers, of staff, of board members, advisory council members, our partner organizations. We're all in this together, and there's been so much strength and support that I have felt in this larger community. And without that, I think CBT would be only a shadow of the organization it is and is becoming. Well, thank you so much for all those comments that I saw in the chat. I'm just moved beyond belief by your remarks. Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us this evening to commemorate International Day in support of victims of torture. The anniversary, the 34th anniversary, actually, of the day when the Convention Against Torture came into effect. And as you've just heard, and as some of you have known for several months, after nearly 10 years as executive director of CBT, in a few days, I'll be stepping aside. This is a position which I have been honored to hold in a remarkable organization whose purpose I couldn't be more passionate about. And as I've reflected on these past years, one recurring theme, as I mentioned in the video, is the gratitude that I have for the privilege, really, that it has been to work every day with the remarkable community that is CBT, the survivors, our clients, the volunteers, the supporters, partners, our advisory council, our board and staff members. And this also, of course, includes you at this gathering this evening. It is an incredible community working together, each playing a vital role in bringing healing and hope for those who've suffered beyond imagination. And like all of you, I too have been especially motivated and touched by the survivors we work with, their individual stories, their courage and resilience. That inspires me and touches my heart every single day. And working here at CBT to heal the wounds of torture has been one of my life's greatest honors. And so many survivors, as they've shared over the years, CBT is a beacon of light and hope in a world that's filled with darkness and despair. And because I've seen what we have been able to do together, I am certain that despite the long road ahead, CBT's light will shine ever brighter in the months and the years ahead. And whether it's further expansion of our vital work in the United States or abroad, or along the southern border, or strengthening our partnerships with activists around the globe, I am both optimistic and excited about CBT's future impact. On June 26, International Day in support of victims of torture, at torture rehabilitation centers the world over, events are held to commemorate this day, to honor survivors, and also to reflect on the loss of those who did not survive, those who were tortured to death. It's a time to recommit ourselves, to redouble our efforts, to rid this scourge from the earth. Thank you for joining us in marking this occasion. The Convention Against Torture not only codified the absolute prohibition on torture, it also promised that victims of torture have the right to compensation and rehabilitation, and that the truth about what they endured be known. And that is why it is imperative to investigate instances of torture, identify the perpetrators, and bring them to justice. On this day, we honor the strength and the resilience of survivors, survivors who transition from horror to healing, who rise again and again from the depths of despair. And we pay tribute to the many people, clinicians and doctors, psychotherapists and social workers, lawyers and human rights advocates and activists who provide hope and support to survivors on their journey to recovery. With every survivor who finds hope and healing, their light burns a little bit brighter. Each of you, too, is a light of hope for a world free of torture and persecution. Today, with the Eclipse Award, we're honoring one of those beacons of light, someone who has worked tirelessly, both around the world and right here at home, to advance human and civil rights and hold those who violate those rights, including perpetrators of torture, accountable for their acts. The Eclipse Award is a symbol of moving from darkness to light, from terror to hope. And this year's recipient exemplifies the importance of accountability for human rights crimes, a necessary step in stopping these violations, whether they occur abroad or in our backyard. It is my honor and my privilege to present the 2021 Eclipse Award to Keith Ellison, Attorney General for the state of Minnesota. Mr. Ellison has served as Attorney General for over 2 years now and oversaw the prosecution of Derek Chauvin, who was found guilty of the murder of George Floyd, who literally tortured George Floyd to death. This verdict was a critically important step towards accountability for the atrocious human rights crime of torture. And that is why today we honor Keith Ellison and everyone in the Attorney General's office for their efforts and their resolve. Mr. Ellison was on the world stage and torture was on trial. He did not allow torture to win. And we also recognize that justice has not been served because George Floyd should still be alive today. There can be no justice for that. Sentencing for Chauvin happens tomorrow, and the world will see how a torturer is held accountable. But today, we celebrate the work of the Attorney General that ensured that one torturer is behind bars. Before becoming the Attorney General, Mr. Ellison represented Minnesota's 5th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. There he championed consumer, worker, environmental, and civil and human rights protections, among many other things. Before entering elective office, he spent 16 years as an attorney specializing in civil rights and defense law, including 5 years as executive director of the Legal Rights Center, overseeing a team of attorneys focused on delivering justice for Minnesotans who had nowhere else to turn. He's also a noted community activist and the first African-American and the first Muslim to be elected to statewide office in Minnesota. I first had the opportunity to meet Keith Ellison when he was a congressional representative, but before I became a resident of his district. I was working in the Gaza Strip, and despite efforts to prevent him from visiting, he persevered, and he came to Gaza. And I might add, the only member of Congress to visit Gaza during my entire time there. He was determined to see and hear for himself firsthand about the abysmal human rights situation there. He didn't lecture, but instead he listened attentively to survivors, student groups, women's groups, human rights groups, as they described what they experienced and how they had survived the latest conflict. And I saw him do this for an entire afternoon. As we have all seen, Keith Ellison's passion for justice continues today And his efforts and his example give us much to celebrate. He is a shining light in what is too often a world of darkness. And I'm proud that he chooses to accept the Eclipse Award today.
Hello, my friends at the Center for Victims of Torture. This is Keith Ellison, Attorney General for the state of Minnesota. And I want to accept the Eclipse Award on behalf of the Office of the Attorney General's Office in Minnesota with tremendous humility and tremendous gratitude. The truth is, George Floyd was tortured. People thought for 8 minutes and 46 seconds that he was strangled and tortured under the knee of Derek Chauvin and 3 other officers, but the truth is it was more like 9 minutes and 29 seconds in which he said he couldn't breathe for 27 times. He asked him to get off him. He told him that he couldn't breathe. He called for his mother, and bystanders watching called out and said, "Stop, check his pulse, get off of him." One officer said early on in this torturous episode, if he can talk, he can breathe. But after he went silent, one of the bystanders said, "He's not breathing now." And they still wouldn't get off, and they continued to stay on top of him. They tortured him. And I just want to say that I feel better knowing that the Center for Victims of Torture is out there every day, standing up for people like George Floyd and others, whether it's in the United States or around the world. Bless you for what you're doing. Thank you for what you're doing. And we will have this award and display it to the world as recognition that torture has no place, and we're building a world without torture. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General, for your extraordinary work in upholding human rights. It's wonderful to know that you are our partner as we work to fulfill our mission of one day living in a world without torture. It takes all of us working together and knowing we have a partner like you, Mr. Ellison, who brings us one step closer to realizing our dreams. And my thanks to each of you for joining us this evening in commemoration of this special day in support of victims of torture. With supporters and friends like you, we will create a more peaceful and just world. As you heard Curt talk earlier, CVT is expanding its focus to address human rights violations here at home. In response to this vitally urgent need, CVT has launched a short-term fundraising campaign to join the movement to end police brutality, heal the entrenched wounds of this violence, and engage the public to advance our healing mission. You will hear much more about this effort soon, with an invitation to join us as a partner in this work. Before we say goodbye, I want to take this opportunity one last time to say thank you to Curt for your services to CVT. As a board member and longtime supporter, it's been my honor to work alongside you, and I wish you the very best of luck in this next phase of your life. You will be missed. I wish all of you good health and good night.